Welcome to True Religion. This is a channel where I show you that the true essence of religion is not religious, and that it's not based on belief, and that it's fundamentally different from the traditional religions that we know. In this video, I want to talk about one of the fundamental ideas that religious figures like Jesus Christ, the Buddha, the Prophet Muhammad, Laozi, and many others talked about. What I'm going to do is this. First, I'm going to talk about this idea in detail, and I will demonstrate to you how it works. And I will show you that this idea is not religious in nature. And then I'm going to use evidence from quote unquote religious scripture to demonstrate to you that those religious figures were talking about this idea. So let's get right into it. This common teaching, which all of those figures talked about, can be summarized in the following way. The world of objects and circumstances surrounding you, while seemingly separate from you and unaware of your presence, is actually an elaborate reflection of your inner private world of thoughts. Now, what does that mean from a practical standpoint? Well, a much more brief way of summarizing this teaching is to say that external experiences are always internal experiences projected. When you go out into the world, you navigate the world. You go into different places and you interact with different objects and you meet different individuals and have experiences with them. While it seems to you that you are experiencing these new places and individuals and objects, you're actually never experiencing them. Instead, you're always, wherever you go, experiencing the private thoughts that you carry with you wherever you go. And because those things around you reflect those ideas to you, it seems to you that your experience comes from them, from the outside. But in reality, it comes from the inside, or it's been coming from the inside all along. To borrow a line from the Jewish religion, we don't see things as they are, but as we are. Now, how do we know that this is actually true? There are a lot of ways to demonstrate to you that objective experience is always reducible to subjective experience. So let's start with something general and simple. Consider the following thought experiment. Let's say one day you're going about your life and you find yourself in a scary situation. And because you are in a scary situation, you feel scared. It's a pretty straightforward experience. The situation was scary before you got there, and because of that, when you entered it, you felt fear. You became frightened, scared yourself. Very clearly, we see that how you felt on the inside was caused by the outside. But now consider this. Let's say, once again, you're going about your business and you find yourself in a scary situation. Except that this time, for whatever reason, you do not feel scared. Now, this is an interesting issue, because if the situation is scary, but when you enter it, you don't feel scared, is the situation scary in the first place? Because of this difference, this contradiction between the external circumstance on the outside and how you feel on the inside, we must now ask ourselves the question, what does it mean when we say that a situation is scary to begin with? And this is where we encounter a very pleasant surprise. When people say that a situation is scary, regardless of what their definition is, it must be one paraphrase or another of the following statement. A scary situation is a situation that one feels scared in. Now, this is huge because the quality of this external situation we're now seeing actually takes its cue from your personal subjective experience. On the flip side, however, from the two examples that we just considered, you could see that the quality of the external situation does not necessarily dictate your internal subjective experience. Just seconds ago, we assumed that the situation being scary is an objective, independent fact. We assumed that the situation is scary before you even came in contact with it. And even when you did come in contact with it, it was scary regardless of your personal feelings about it on the inside. And because of this, we assumed the experience was caused by the outside and saw its result in the inside. But our little investigation just showed us that the way reality works is actually the other way around. A scary situation, by definition, is a situation that one feels scared in. The situation's qualification to be scary depends on your personal, private, subjective experience. In other words, the experience starts from the inside and gets projected on the outside. When you come in contact with a situation, you actually kick off the experience by having personal, private, subjective feelings of fear. And because of that, then this situation outside of you takes on the quality of your subjective world. The same process takes place when you approach the same situation with different thoughts. Once again, you experience your own thoughts planted onto the outside world. But if you don't know that that's how things work, it seems to you that those qualities come from the outside world. Let's take another, but this time concrete example. Let's say you have a job, you work at a company, and you have a boss. One day, you're at work and your boss comes in. He's very hot-headed, very angry. He looks at you and he starts berating you and belittling you in front of everyone. He calls you stupid, he tells you that your work is horrible, and then he yells at you and storms out of the room. Now this is by all means a horrible experience. You feel disrespected, you feel terrified, and you feel disempowered. You feel very small. Now, the conventional way of understanding what happened here is that your negative experience came from the outside. Your boss came into the room, he said the horrible things that he said to you, and as a result of that, you have a horribly negative experience on the inside. But that's not actually what happens. What happens, mechanically speaking, is the following. As a human being, you practice and harbor all kinds of thoughts all day long. Some of these thoughts are neutral, some of them are positive, but like most humans on the planet, a great portion of our thoughts about ourselves and our position in the world and our relationship with the world are extremely negative. Now, at any given moment, you're not aware of all of your thoughts at once. Sometimes something happens on the outside that triggers a certain thought to come to the forefront. For example, you might be having a conversation with somebody, they might say something, and that makes you remember an appointment that you have. You weren't consciously aware of this thought, which is the appointment or whatever, and the circumstance surrounding you, which is a conversation, triggered this thought and brought it to the forefront. When your boss comes into the office and belittles you and disrespects you in front of everyone, that action simply accentuates and brings to the forefront numerous negative thoughts that you've been practicing about yourself all along. The extreme pain and agony that you experience in a situation like this actually comes from you becoming aware of all these negative thoughts that you've been harboring about yourself and about your position in the world, not because of the boss's words. To see that that's actually what happens in a situation like this, consider the following. Let's say we swapped you with another person. Unlike you, this other person has unwavering, shattering self-confidence. And such a person is not really a hypothetical case. Every once in a while, you run into somebody like that. If the horrible experience and the real experience that you had was actually caused by the external circumstance, which in this case are the boss's words, then we would expect this person to have an identical experience. But of course, we know that that's not the case. Your experience and this person's experience in this situation are not only different, but they can be radically different. Since neither of you actually experiences the words of the boss, and instead, each one of you experiences their own thoughts, which they have been harboring about themselves and about their place in the world. This person would experience their own thoughts. Thoughts like the following: what others say about me is not true, only what I think about myself is true. And because this person experiences this thought, not the boss's words, the untruth of the boss's words is very obvious to him. Unlike you, this person does not experience the thought, "I'm very vulnerable and cannot afford to respond to disrespect." And because of that, they promptly respond to their boss. They probably put their boss in place. Your experience of that thought prevents you from acting in that way. It's not the boss's words. It's thoughts like this that characterize your experience. And it's the lack of thoughts like this that characterize this other person's experience. Another way to see that you never actually experience external circumstances, but instead your private thoughts that are reflected in them, is to think of one and the same circumstance that brings forth in your mind radically different sets of thoughts. For example, let's assume once again that you work in a company and you have a boss, but this time, instead of disrespecting you, your boss comes to the office and he tells everyone that worked this past Saturday is fired, and your boss then leaves the room. Now you work a regular schedule, Monday to Friday. You don't work Saturdays. And so, given that, your experience in this situation is more or less neutral. The boss just made an announcement that does not pertain to you. Sure, you could say the experience is slightly negative because you're concerned for others, but it's not a horrible experience. Generally, there's just this air of indifference that you just experienced. But 30 minutes later, you suddenly remember that you actually came into work this past Saturday because you covered someone else's shift. And so now your experience becomes extremely negative. You realize that the announcement pertains to you, and once again you experience fear, disempowerment, despair, and maybe even disrespect. If the boss's words have an inherent experience to them, if they actually are the cause for your experience, you wouldn't have two radically opposing experiences. Notice also that the shift in your experience from one extreme to another corresponds to the shift in your thoughts from one set of thoughts to another radically different set of thoughts. In the beginning, you didn't experience the boss's words. Instead, you experienced your own thoughts. Thoughts like, I am safe, I am protected with an income, there are no radical changes in my experience, everything is going as usual. And then in the second case, 30 minutes later, you didn't experience the boss's words either. Instead, you experienced thoughts like, I am now vulnerable, I'm not sure if I could provide for my family. You also experience other negative thoughts like, I have a tiny place in this world. I am replaceable. My future is at the mercy of my superior at work. One word from my superior at work and my entire future is now at jeopardy. It is the experience of those thoughts that causes the negative emotions that you experience, not the boss's words. Just like the experience of the first set of thoughts gave you feelings of neutrality and indifference, not the boss's words either. The best way to see that you never actually experience external circumstances is to encounter an experience where no external circumstance is provided. Now, in keeping with the theme of working at a company and having a boss, consider the following. Let's say you are a woman and your name is Catherine. You work at a company and you have a boss, and one day you overhear your boss telling the secretary, Catherine is fired. Your boss doesn't say that to you, he says it to the secretary, but you overhear him. As expected, this is a horrible experience. Once again, you experience all kinds of fears, feelings of disempowerment and despair, and whatnot. But let's say that what your boss said was not Catherine is fired. Instead, he said Catherine is tired. And you, because you're tired, simply misheard him. You realize now that the statement Catherine is fired was literally never said in the first place. And yet, you had just as real and as vivid of a negative experience as someone who was in fact told that they were let go of. One religious figure that we all know who understood that that's how reality works is the man that we call Jesus Christ. In the 4 canonical Gospels, Jesus goes from town to town to spread his message. And along the way, he performs a lot of healings. He heals people that are sick or crippled, blind, mute, possessed, people that have leprosy, and other conditions. If you've ever read the New Testament, there's something rather curious that Jesus always does whenever he performs a healing. He always makes sure to clarify to the people that he heals that healing never actually came from the external circumstances, and it never came from Jesus himself. In other words, it's not that Jesus touched them and that's why they were healed. Instead, the presence of Jesus accentuates within them a very strong belief that they can be healed. And it's that belief that heals them rather than Jesus himself. In Matthew 9:22 and Mark 5:34, the same story is told of a woman that suffers from chronic bleeding. And she's instantly healed when she touches the cloak of Jesus Christ. In both stories, when Jesus feels that his cloak has been touched and understands what's been happening, he turns around to the woman and he says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." He says this in a context where it's assumed by the woman and by everyone that it was Jesus himself who healed her. In Luke 17:19, there is a similar story. A group of men who had been suffering from leprosy, they run into Jesus and they believe that he can heal them. So they approach him and they plead with him that he heal them. And so he directs them to go and meet with the priests. And when they respond to his command and they do that, they're instantly cleansed. One of them comes back to Jesus and he throws himself at his feet. And in response to this, Jesus says, "Your faith has made you well." In this story, this man who has just been healed is extremely emotional. The story says that he runs back to Jesus and he throws himself at his feet, like I said, and is essentially displaying immense gratitude for Jesus for healing him. And it's against this context that Jesus' words are very, very telling, because they serve the purpose of clarifying to this man where the healing came from. In Mark 10:52 and Luke 18:42, we have another story of a blind man. This man tries so hard to get to Jesus because he believes that Jesus can heal him, but people rebuke him. Eventually, Jesus calls on him to come forward, and so he does. Jesus heals him, as the story goes, and then once again clarifies to him, "Your faith has healed you." In Matthew chapter 9, there is a very similar story, probably meant to be the same story, except that this time there is 2 blind men rather than 1 who approach Jesus, and they ask him to heal them. There's more details in this story that are very telling. Before performing the healing, Jesus explicitly asks them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" And when both men say yes, instead of instantly declaring that they are healed, Jesus instead says, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." And then both men are healed. And the implication there is that they believed that the healing is possible, and that's why they were healed. Jesus says something very similar in another healing that's reported in Matthew chapter 8. There, Jesus enters Capernaum, and a centurion comes to him and tells him that one of his servants is paralyzed and is lying in deep pain at home. And he asks Jesus to heal the servant. The centurion then kind of gives a brief speech, kind of a poetic speech, expressing his deep belief that Jesus is capable of healing this servant. And in response to that, Jesus is impressed with his faith. Once again, instead of taking responsibility for the servant's healing, Jesus says the following instead: "Go and let it be done just as you believed it would." The centurion goes home, and of course the servant is healed, and the implication there that he believed that the healing would take place, and that is the cause for the healing. In Mark 5:36 and in Luke 8:50, Jesus says a very similar line to a synagogue leader. Now, this synagogue leader comes to Jesus Christ because his daughter is very sick at home, essentially on the verge of death. And he asks Jesus to come home with him to heal the girl. On their way to the house, people meet the man and they tell him that his daughter has already died. And that's when Jesus turns around to the synagogue leader and says something very telling. He says, "Don't be afraid, just believe." The reason why this line is telling is because it implies that the man's internal belief that the healing is possible is very crucial for the healing to take place. Now, if healing comes from the internal, very strong belief in the possibility of being healed, and if Jesus' role, as he himself understood it, was to only arouse and bring to the forefront these strong beliefs in oneself, it follows that if Jesus were to meet someone who wanted to be healed, but did not on the inside truly believe in the possibility of being healed, it follows that a healing cannot possibly take place there. The Gospels talk about that. In Matthew 13:58, Jesus goes back to his hometown of Nazareth, and something kind of unexpected happens there. He did not do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. Let's get back to the main idea of this video, which is that external experiences, or what seem like external experiences, are in fact your internal thoughts being placed at a distance from you. In light of that, check out the following quote attributed to the Buddha. It's the first line of the Dhammapada. "All that we are is the result of what we have thought. It is founded on our thoughts. It is made up of our thoughts." The Quran, the holiest book in mainstream Islam, also touches on this idea. You see, if your external experiences are reducible to your internal ones, it follows that you change your experience of the external world by changing your inner thoughts and beliefs. Hence the following verse. Allah, meaning God, does not change the condition of a people until they change that which is in themselves. There is a similar verse in the Al-Anfal section of the Quran. The verse reads the following: Allah would never change a blessing which he has bestowed upon a people until they change that which is in themselves. I've been mostly talking about external experiences, but this idea also applies to individuals. The way you experience another specific individual and the way they, quote unquote, make you feel is ultimately reducible to your internal world. It results from your thoughts and your beliefs about your relationship to them and about your respective places in the world. Let's take a famous figure like Pope Leo, the head of the Vatican Church, as an example. There is no inherent reality to Pope Leo, meaning the way Pope Leo is experienced depends on the observer. If a devout Catholic were to meet Pope Leo in person, they would experience genuine awe and happiness. In fact, the experience might be an explosion of a sort. They might be starstruck or overwhelmed by meeting this person. If a non-religious person, a person that doesn't subscribe to any religion, meets Pope Leo, the experience would be to a great extent one of indifference. But there might be a slight feeling of awe. After all, Pope Leo is a famous person. And if the observer is an extremist who subscribes to a different religion, if they were to meet Pope Leo, they would probably experience genuine hatred and anger. And if the Pope appears too powerful to them, they might even experience fear or disempowerment. None of these people are actually experiencing Pope Leo directly. Instead, they're experiencing their own thoughts and beliefs. Amazingly, these observers do not realize that this is how their experience works. To put it in an analogy, they don't realize that they themselves are the projectors of the movie they're watching. The devout Catholic, for example, imagines that the Pope's status as a special human being exists out there in the world, independent of whether he believes it or not, and that he's simply aware of this fact that exists out there in the world. The same is true for the extremist. The extremist also believes that the evil nature of the Pope exists out there in the world, and unlike others, he's being more honest by being aware of this fact. He doesn't realize that he is the originator of this experience by virtue of the beliefs he chooses to hold. Notice that if the extremist were to change his beliefs, let's say, for whatever reason, the extremist becomes a Christian, all of a sudden, he experiences a different Pope. Ultimately, there are as many versions of Pope Leo as there are observers, because what each one of those observers considers to be external objective reality is in fact just their own subjective internal reality. Or as a lot of people like to put it, perception is reality. That is the point of this video. Now, of course, a man like Jesus Christ understood that that's how reality works. Check out the following line attributed to him. Whoever welcomes a prophet as a prophet receives a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous man as a righteous man will receive a righteous man's reward. The Prophet Muhammad talked about the same idea. In one hadith, which according to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad is paraphrasing words revealed to him by God, God says the following: I am as my worshipper's assumption of me is. If he assumes good, it is so. If he assumes bad, it is so. Now, if all external experiences are just internal experiences being placed at a distance from their source, it follows that we always choose our experiences. And that's because the mental orientation that you approach a situation with determines what kind of situation you just approached. This idea, which is that what you put out into the world comes back to you in the form of experience, pervades all spiritual traditions. In fact, it's central to many spiritual traditions. But notice that this idea is not religious. It's not something that you have to believe. It's something that you can verify in your experience. And believing in this has nothing to do with believing that a certain individual or a certain group of individuals are divine or semi-divine or divinely guided. These things are often conflated in traditional religion. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha says that if a person commits evil, evil falls back upon the fool, like light dust thrown up against the wind. The Prophet Muhammad says, "He who does not show mercy is not shown mercy." In traditional religion, lines like these are interpreted as meaning, don't go around being cruel to people because a ruthless overseeing man in the sky will eventually catch you and he will be ruthless to you. So to not rouse his anger, you might as well stick to the rules. But the line is very clear and very simple. And the non-religious nature of the line is also very clear and very simple. He who does not show mercy is not shown mercy. Your internal experience is synonymous with your external experience. Your subjective experience, which you put into the world, is synonymous with the objective experience that you receive from the world. With that in mind, listen to the following line, a pretty famous line, attributed to Jesus Christ. "Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." To see that these statements are fundamentally not religious, and that instead they are belief-free descriptions of how reality works, go back to the few thought experiments I included in the beginning of this video. One way to summarize the scary situation example in the beginning of the video is to say the following: express fear, and you shall experience frightening situations. Express indifference, and you shall experience neutral situations. One way to summarize the other example, where your boss comes into the office and yells at you, is to say the following: those who think little of themselves shall experience disrespectful bosses. A shorter version could go something like this: disrespect, and you shall be disrespected. By contrast, those confident in themselves shall experience little angry bosses that can be put in their places easily. And a shorter version will be respect, and you will be respected. Read the following lines from religious books and notice that the same concept is being discussed here. Notice also that this concept, once again, is just not religious in nature. The Quran says, "Evil scheming overwhelms none but its authors." When you initiate an experience by resorting first in your thoughts and then in your actions to deception and trickery in order to get what you want, then by definition, you created a world where that which you desire is not easily available to you. It is for this reason that evil scheming overwhelms none but its authors. Once again, the very attitude you approached the world with becomes synonymous with the world you just approached. The Tao Te Ching, which is essentially one of the main texts in Taoism, says the following: "Those who steal from others impoverish themselves." Most people assume that it's lack of abundance that drives them to disempowered actions, such as stealing, but it's actually the other way around. The moment you feel like you have to steal something, that right there is the moment that you lose it. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, "Long is the night to him who is awake." Once again, we're encountering the same idea. What seems like the external experience of time being long, out there in the world, outside of your control, is actually the internal experience of being fixated on waiting and anticipation. Notice, for example, that if someone is not waiting for something, waiting being an internal experience, by definition, they do not experience its absence, which seems like an external experience. The very next line in that verse is, "Long is the mile to him who is tired." The implication here is that short is the mile to him who is energized. The two travelers are experiencing the same mile differently because they're not experiencing an external mile to begin with. Each traveler is actually experiencing their internal state, which is then projected onto the mile. But if neither traveler is aware of this, it seems to one traveler that the mile being long is an external independent experience that exists out there in the world, regardless of his internal world. And the same is true for the other traveler. Well, someone might ask, well, what is it? Is the mile objectively long or is it short? If you are a student of quantum physics, or if you are slightly familiar with the field, my answer is going to sound familiar. The mile is literally both. There are literally as many versions of the mile as there are observers. The partial subjective experience of each observer is experienced as the objective truth for that observer. Now, someone might say that's not true, that's absurd. The fact that each observer experiences their own version of the same mile is not real. But notice that this person, by definition, is an observer. And the fact that objective reality exists is their subjective version of the situation. In the poem known as Verses on the Faith Mind, the Chinese third patriarch of Zen, Xing Ming, says the following: "The faster they hurry, the slower they go." What seems like the external experience of things being slow and taking time is actually the internal experience of impatience. The central idea discussed in this video is quite revolutionary. Think about it. If things on the outside, meaning processes, events, the way nature works, other people's actions and decisions, if that stuff takes too long, that stuff is by definition outside of your control. But if what seems like that experience happening on the outside is actually the internal experience of being impatient, then that is huge news. Because being patient or being impatient is something that you can train yourself into and train yourself out of. It is this idea that Laozi talks about when he says, "Those who are content with what they have are not in danger of loss." And by the way, the Tao Te Ching is filled with other lines that echo previous quotes I mentioned of the Prophet Muhammad and Jesus Christ. Check the following lines out. "Hoarding invites loss. Those who live by violence, violence will soon destroy. The more laws and orders are issued, the more thieves and robbers abound. We live in very exciting times. For centuries, these ideas were esoteric, meaning they were understood by the few and they were misunderstood by the masses. And the form which this misunderstanding took is what we call organized traditional religion. Because once again, these ideas are fundamentally not religious. And because for centuries, people assumed that one's perception of the world and the world that one perceives are two separate things that are not connected to one another. Science has been interested in studying the external world. Newtonian mechanics, for example, which is the form that physics took for centuries, that's basically the stuff that you learned in high school if you've ever taken a physics class. All the stuff about mass and force and movement and gravitational forces and whatnot. That stuff is the study of the external physical world, how objects move in the world. But within the past 100 years alone, even less than that, with the rise of quantum physics, which of course is a reflection of the development and advancement of our collective consciousness as a species, the strict separation between observer and observed is collapsing. One of the most outstanding discoveries of quantum physics is the observer's effect. The observer's effect is the idea that when you observe something in order to study it, for example, when you observe a situation or a system with the intent of studying it, the mere act of you observing it changes it. Now, this idea has been adopted in many other fields. It is used widely in the humanities today, especially in fields like psychology and anthropology. But the way it was discovered in quantum physics is especially important because there we're talking about the physical world. We usually assume that a tiny particle, like an electron, is basically a regular object existing in a fixed position. And that's natural, because that's how we think of physical objects in general. If you go outside into the street and you see a building, the building exists in one place as opposed to another. And the same is true for any other physical object that we are familiar with in life. But that's not how electrons actually behave. And by the way, I'm using electrons as just one example, but all extremely tiny particles behave in the same way. In the 20th century, physicists found out that an electron is not really one object existing in a fixed position. Instead, and this is a little counterintuitive, an electron is a field of probabilities. Rather than having a fixed position, a single electron literally exists in multiple places simultaneously at varying probabilities. But when an observer comes into the picture, so for example, when a quantum physicist observes and studies an electron, they actually perceive the electron as existing in one fixed position. The way physicists like to describe it is to say that this field of probabilities collapses into a certainty through the eyes of an observer. The multiple positions which the electron exists in simultaneously collapse into a certain single fixed position. This is really eye-opening because it's easy to think of the stuff that I have been talking about as just motivational stuff, just a nice, well-intentioned analogy. But these findings from quantum physics, they not only show that this stuff is not an analogy, not only is it true in a literal sense, but it's even true for the most quote-unquote real, non-wishy-washy thing we have in reality, which is physical matter itself. Physical matter, down to its subconstituents, is literally made up of an infinite number of versions. And the version that is ultimately experienced by someone depends on that someone. But more importantly, it follows that if the observer were to alter himself, meaning were to alter his perception, the very reality he or she is observing must inevitably change. The third Zen patriarch, Sheng Meng, talked about this idea. The idea that the mind creates the very reality it perceives. Listen to this line from the same poem I referenced earlier. When the thinking subject vanishes, so too do the objects created by the mind. Listen also to this line from the same poem. If the mind makes no discriminations, the 10,000 things are as they are, of a single essence. Everything that I have said in this video can be summarized by saying that everything around you in the world essentially has an infinite number of versions that it can be perceived in. And you determine what version you perceive through the thoughts and the beliefs that you hold in your private mind. I demonstrated that through many examples and thought experiments, and I showed you that it matches what quantum physics has been discovering about physical reality. But the world also takes place in your mind in a much more grand way that you may struggle to believe. Your thoughts and beliefs not only determine the version you experience of the circumstances surrounding you, but over time, they determine what circumstances you end up in the first place. The same also goes for individuals. I've been telling you in this video that the thoughts and beliefs you harbor and practice determine the version you experience of the people in your life. But over time, they also determine the kind of people you end up encountering in the first place. Life, in this sense, is truly one big dream. And the events of your life and your pathway into the future is a lot more malleable and a lot more personal than you think. Now, I should clarify right away that this is not true in the absolute. There is another factor, namely destiny, which I will be talking about in a future video, that also determines your path in life. But even though it's not true in the absolute, it does, however, remain true that the events that take place in your life are not random, and they are instead closely connected to the thoughts you harbor and practice. The famous psychiatrist Carl Jung talked a lot about this idea, and that's why I included his quote at the beginning of this video. Let me remind you of this quote real quick. When an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. Jung also coined the term synchronicity for a phenomenon that he observed and studied in his clients. Synchronicities are meaningful, unexpected coincidences. Basically, it's when a bunch of events happen. Let's say 2 or more events take place, either at the same time or in succession. The events themselves have no causal or logical connection to one another. But when they do take place in succession, for example, they provide a deep personal and a meaningful experience to the person experiencing them. An example of what we could call a synchronicity is something like the following. Let's say you have a medical issue in your body. You got a problem with your back. And for years, you've been going from one expert to another, but no one has been able to figure out what's wrong with you. And so after years of trying, you put the matter aside and then you go on with your life. Soon after you do that, one day as you're heading to work, let's say you walk to work, the road that you usually take and which you have been taking for years is now blocked for whatever reason. Because of that, you have to reroute and you have to walk a different road to go to work. So you take a different road that you've never taken before. As you walk on that road, you see a store sign that captures your attention. The store sign contains the name of the store owner, and the name of the store owner is very similar to the name of your childhood friend. Now, the names are not identical per se, but they're similar enough that it captures your attention and it makes you stop. Because you stop, you happen to stop next to a person, a complete stranger on the side of the road, who's making a phone call, and you're able to have access to what they're talking about. You can overhear them. On the phone, this stranger is talking to a friend, and they're discussing a medical problem, which they have recently been able to recover from after years of trying. As you listen to the conversation, this problem turns out to be identical to yours. As the conversation goes on, this person mentions the one expert, the single expert, who was able to figure out what's wrong with them after years of failing. You then take that information and you book an appointment with this expert. When you go to this expert, the expert tells you that originally they were unable to take you, but a client canceled moments before you booked your appointment, and that's why the slot was available and you were able to book the appointment. And then the expert tells you that that's really good news for you because the expert is closing down their practice and they're moving out of the country for good. There is no causal or logical connection between the co-occurrence of these events. In other words, these events do not know about each other. The closure of the road, basically the people that decided to close the road down, know nothing about the presence of the store sign that captured your attention. The person in that store knows nothing about the presence of the bystander on the phone conversation. And the bystander with the phone conversation knows nothing about you or your problem. And the expert who finally resolves your problem knows nothing about any of this. The person who canceled the appointment last minute knows nothing about any of this. And yet, it is as if all of these events co-occurred in a way that creates an experience that is personal and tailored to you. While these events have no causal connection between each other, in the objective sense, they curiously somehow arrange for an experience that specifically addresses something that's been prominent in your thoughts. In other words, when you look at the situation and you think in terms of cause and effect, one thing happening as a result of another thing happening, you notice that there is a connection between two things. But what's curious is that one of those things is a series of events in the physical world. The other side happens in your thoughts. It is as if the events of the world in your life have access to that which you think about. Synchronicities show you, in a way that's pretty pronounced, that the fourth wall is broken between the world surrounding you and your mind. In your own life or in the lives of others, you can't help but find these unmistakable connections between events happening in the mind and their counterparts happening in the physical world. These include being paranoid or constantly afraid of something in the mind and it actually happening in the world. Having low self-esteem in the mind and somehow repeatedly encountering abusive partners in the world. Having specific pet peeves in the mind and somehow always encountering them wherever you go in the world. And finally, relaxing and giving up on something in the mind and it somehow unexpectedly working out in the world. The Buddha, of course, talked a lot about this. Anyone who is not even interested in Buddhism is familiar with the concept of karma. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha actually lists a number of circumstances which he says will inevitably happen to someone who inflicts pain upon others. These include physical injury, being on the receiving end of a misfortune by a king, being accused of something, or having your house burned down. But ultimately, the fact that the Buddha said anything or Carl Jung said anything, or Jesus Christ, or the Prophet Muhammad, or Laozi, or anyone else said anything, doesn't mean that you should believe it. It doesn't matter what lifelong followers of those people tell you. Ultimately, it's possible that they are wrong. Now, if you've watched this video, if you've watched any part of it, you probably already know that I don't think they're wrong and that I actually agree with them. But it does you no good to just take their word for it. Traditional religion usually has seemingly complex theories with big words that explain why you should follow those people blindly, but you need not believe that either. Turning a great, exceptional teacher who himself would have wanted you to see things firsthand the way he sees them, turning such a teacher into some sort of an infallible divine being that should be followed blindly is the business of traditional religion. And it's ultimately a misunderstanding of the very message of those same great teachers. The idea that I spent this video talking about is true, but don't take my word for it either. That's why I provided examples and thought experiments all throughout. If you're interested in this, take some time to think about those examples and to go over them in your head. And if you see it for yourself, congratulations, then you know it's true. If you don't see it, or if you choose to not believe it, or to not engage in it, that's also fine. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.